Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at the Proto Evangelium. Now, that's a funny word. A lot of people associate it with modern animated series. And, don't be intimidated by it because really it's not that important. What it essentially means is, it's a fancy way of saying it's the prequel to the Gospels in Genesis. Now, when I first encountered this, I was like, whoa, this is weird. What do you mean there is a prototype of the Gospels in Genesis? How does that work? I don't see any crucifixion or anything happening at that point, nothing so literal, but we do have allusions to what is to come. God is all knowing and all powerful and has foresight. And so God is looking ahead to what is to come and he is alluding to it. He's kind of giving hints and signs. And, as we're told later in the New Testament, we see now through a glass but darkly or dimly. We don't have the whole picture throughout this portion of the Bible until we get to the New Testament. And that prequel looks a lot like, the rest of the Bible time and times again. Well, first off, woman is deceived, and then she brings the fruit to man, and man eats it knowing, he is not deceived by the serpent like Eve is. He knows better. He has heard the voice of God in the garden directly telling him, do not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he knows better. And he still breaks God's law, despite being a perfect being created by the hand of God himself, with no sin in him at this point, up until he eats that fruit and breaks God's law. So man says, I will usurp the power of God. I'll do it myself. You kind of want to take things into your own hands instead of trusting God. And we always like to push limits. That's just kind of innate in our human nature. If you put us in a perfect place and tell us not to do one thing, we're going to try and do the one thing. And God, I think, is absent at this point in the garden in the story because he is allowing man to operate freely, to operate on his own. Man is an entity with free will, and he knows that, and he wants them to be able to exercise their judgment for themselves. Do you eat of the fruit, or do you, and, partake of that and become sinful and break my law and ruin what you've been given on your own? Or do you trust what I've said? And of course, man does not trust what God says. We kind of push back and we decide that we want to do it ourselves. So then, again, like the rest of the Bible, man breaks God's law and then man immediately becomes miserable in sin, miserable. Now that's an interesting thing to think about because a lot of people see like the visible sins and they think, well, they've broken away from God. They're living their best life now, they're doing things on their own way. But no, man becomes miserable in sin. They're ashamed of what they've done, just completely ashamed. They're hiding themselves. They know they're naked now and they can't live um, freely like they had up until that point. So they're making garments to hide themselves and they are kind of separated from one another, man and woman. Now, at this point, they're essentially a married couple, and I believe it actually outright says that right before this at chapter 2 at the end. But here, this married couple, all of a sudden, because of sin and because of breaking God's law, they are both miserable and they're both separated. And then God comes down into the garden and man makes excuses for what he's done. We like to make excuses for things that we do, sins that we commit. We like to say, well, no, it was so and so's fault. It was my wife's fault in this case. Or, well, it was because, you gave me this woman and she convinced me and, you gave me the woman, God, so obviously it's your fault. Even though he's not outright saying it's your fault, he's essentially trying to pin the blame not on himself but on his wife, who he is supposed to be, the head of the household and ruling his household well. He's trying to blame his wife, and he's even almost pinning it on God. And then God goes to the woman, and she makes excuses as well and says, "Well, the serpent tricked me," which is true. She was beguiled by the serpent, but both of those times when God is asking them what they've done, do you not think that God knows exactly what's happened? Do you not think that God has had a front row seat to everything? I mean, he is an all knowing, all powerful entity. He knows everything. How could he not know exactly what's happening? So he gives them these chances here because I think he's seeking relationship with man. He's trying to give them a chance to ask for forgiveness, to, at least confess what they've done honestly. And they have that opportunity in free will, I think. But both times they give excuses instead, and they ignore chances for repentance. And then we see God's judgment in that, because God is a merciful God. He's perfectly merciful, but he's also perfectly just. And so every sin requires a judgment, an answer. And so he, of course, passes judgment, and we'll look more at that in a moment when we go through the full thing. But I'm lining all of this out to show you that this is starting to look a lot more like the relationship between God and man for the rest of the Bible. But we're missing something here. We're still in the Old Testament and we're missing something. What is it? Well, we're missing a redemption, a intercession, that is. We have God's judgment as it is in the Old Testament, and that would be it normally. But here, in this Proto Evangelium, where we see the gospel itself, the New Testament outlined almost, we see something interesting. So here in verse 15, it says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." So enmity, it's like there's strife, there's hatred almost between these two, between thee and the woman. So that doesn't mean all snakes, because it says the serpent, and obviously it's very strongly alluded to that this is in some form Satan, a spiritual entity that is operating under the guise of a snake, and the woman. So there's going to be enmity between the descendants of this woman, which is all of humanity, and thee, so Satan, and between thy seed and her seed. Now we see seed, and it's weird to see with a woman, but it's essentially saying, offspring or descendants, and it's not meaning a literal sense. That is a biblical, um, honestly, just a heresy, that two-seedism is a thing. It's this idea that Satan has his seed and God has his seed, and, they literally intervene in the womb and make someone wicked by their seed from the womb. And it's just a ridiculous notion that's not supported biblically. But here it is saying that there will be strife between the descendants of Eve and those that try to usurp God's throne. Those people in the future that follow after Satan and the path that he's laid out as a rebellious angel and try to seek the throne of God and, get it for themselves for their own petty power. And it says, "It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." Now here we start to get a little bit of more interesting, because we see that bruise thy head. That's a head wound. That's fatal. That's something that is permanent, like a blow that kills, especially on a snake. Usually whenever a snake turns up around here, we end up, usually taking a garden hoe or a shovel or some kind of machete or something just to get a little bit of reach, and we chop it right behind the head, cut its head off, because then it cannot bite. And so you see this bruise here, that is a fatal wound, and thou shalt bruise his heel. So that's a temporary, that's almost like a flesh wound. Now again, snakes, that's not fun either way, but that's not nearly as bad as a head wound. So I think what we're seeing here is a picture of what is to come, where there's going to be fighting between godly people and ungodly people throughout history. There's going to be strife and enmity. And at the end of it all, at the culmination of it all, there will be an exchange in which the seed of godliness prevails and kills and, finally finishes this seed of evil. But there's going to be a bruise to the heel. And I think about the crucifixion, which was not a permanent death for Jesus Christ. It was a temporary wounding more than anything. He did fully die, and he did go into the grave, and he did rise again, because he is Jesus Christ. He is all powerful. It's God. And so you see this exchange lined out, and then he goes into the rest of their punishments down through here. Now, again, he is very fair in what he does. He gives the woman pain in childbirth, and he gives the man labor, because you want to do things for yourself and you don't want to listen to my law. You're not going to get the benefits of the relationship in fullness. I'm not going to walk in the garden with you. In fact, you're not going to be in the garden at all. So he casts man and woman out, And he says, you're going to have to fight with the land to get your bread, but you're still going to be fed. So even now, he steps in immediately and starts outlining what's going to happen in his judgment. And it's righteous, it's fair, because he says, you'll still be able to eat. You'll just have to work for it now. You want to do stuff yourself without the benefits of my relationship. You're going to do it for yourself. And Adam called his wife's name Eve. Now, this part is the most beautiful part to me because we have this whole back and forth, this very petty thing between Adam and Eve, where Adam is, well, this is the woman you gave me. It's no longer his woman, even though at the end of chapter 2, we see that they are, husband and wife and they're one flesh and they love each other. And now, they go through all this stuff. And after it, I think Adam looks at Eve and he feels awful, no doubt, for what he's said and done and what he's allowed to happen. But he knows that even in death, in God's plan, there is life. And so Adam looks at his wife Eve and calls her that because she is the mother of all living. And so God then, of course, provides them coats of skin. So where before they were clothed in fig leaves, just kind of haphazardly sewn together fig leaves, Adam and his wife are clothed by God in new garments that are much better. And, kind of like a new man almost. And they're sent out with these new coats of the garden because they've eaten of the tree of good and evil. But if they eat of the tree of life, they will live forever. And they can't do that in the state that they're in and, things work out. So God sends them out, He drives them out, and He forbids them from entering back in. So again, Proto Evangelium, we see this outline of the traditional path that man follows over and over and over cyclically. We break God's law, we try and do things ourselves, we become miserable, and we need God. But even when God confronts us, we still try to make excuses and we don't ask for repentance like we should. And God passes judgment. But then, even in judgment, even in death from sin, which we deserve, there is life in God. Thank you.